Hey guys, it's me again. I'm going to take you through this indices and logs type of question here for the SO/AA mathematics course. The subtopic is indices, or in other words, powers. More specifically, uses a quadratic method to solve it. The difficulty level for this question, I would say, is medium to hard, and it is a non-calculator question. So this would come from paper 1, which is a non-calculator paper. This is a nice question because it will help us practice and use a whole lot of skills. And obviously, because it's a 5-mark question, of course, they would expect that you will need at least a few steps to solve the question. So the skills we're going to be using are the manipulation of indices, or powers, if you will. I prefer maybe calling them powers. We will also do some basic rearranging of equations. Again, this is a skill you are expected to know from previous years of studying mathematics. So this is assumed prior knowledge. Solving quadratic equations, this is also assumed to be prior knowledge, so namely by factorizing those quadratics and by using the null factor law. And finally, is solving an exponential equation. So there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of skills that this question uses, and it is no surprise that it is worth 5 marks. So let's jump right in. In the first step, what I've done is, the first thing I have to do is change the base of 9 to make it also a base of 3. Because that's really the first step with regards to making this equation more manageable. So first we change the base into a base of 3 as well. And this is where I'm using my power manipulation skills. So if that is something you may not know how to do, or maybe a little bit rusty at, this step here might be something you want to practice with manipulating powers. So that's my first working step here. Then we kind of have to recognize that this is actually a quadratic. It may not look like a quadratic yet, but it is actually a quadratic because this base of 3 has double the power that this base of 3 does. So you could think of this as like 3 squared, and this is 3 to the power of 1. So whichever way you look at it, the power of that term here is double the power of that term. And so we kind of think of this as a quadratic, and that's why we're going to be using our quadratic solving skills to solve this equation, even though it may not initially be obvious. Another way we could try to solve this is by trial and error, and you could try out different numbers in here to see what will make the equation balance. But again, if we do it by trial and error, we're not going to be able to get the full 5 marks. So it is expected that we use the quadratic solving method here. My next step of working is just to make it equal to 0. So I'm just rearranging the equation to make it equal 0. In the next step, I need to factorize this equation. The factorization I will explain a little bit if we just follow me down here. If for a moment we pretend that 3 to the power of x is kind of like a, and I've just put the power of 1 here just so that you could see that this is still just a, and even though you don't write the power is 1. So the equation that we're dealing with is this here. That blue equation is what we're dealing with. And so when you substitute a for 3 to the power of x, you actually end up with that equation here. So this is the equation that you end up with, and this is just a basic quadratic equation that equals 0. And also, again, I've included the coefficient in front of the a, just so you could see that the coefficient is 1, and you could see that the power is 1. So this is just minus a, basically. So when we factorize it, you end up with this factorization here. And then when we substitute back the 3 to the power of x for a, you end up with these 2 brackets. So essentially, that's how we end up factorizing this equation, even though it doesn't really look like a quadratic. So we have now completed working step 3. We factorize the equation. So what happens in the next step, we're going to use the null factor law so that we essentially solve those 2 brackets separately. And that is what the null factor law is all about. because either that first bracket must equal 0 or the contents of the second bracket must equal 0. And so we're going to be solving them separately because that's the only way you could get a product of 0. So we set up our working step 4. So if we focus on the left-hand side here and we try to solve that equation there, we move the 2 to the other side and you get 3 to the power of x equals -2. But this is where we have to recognize that there is going to be no solution for that one, because no matter what power for x you place there, there's no way you can get it to give you a negative answer, such as -2. You can try 5, you could try -2, you could try a half, you could try -1/2, you could try 0, you could try any power for x here, and there is no power that can give you a negative answer of -2 here. And so for that reason, this part of the null factor law gives us no solution. So there's no answer here. So if we go back to the second equation and we try and solve the second equation, we simply move the 3 to the other side. So 3 to the power of x equals 3. And then just by simple inspection, you can tell, just by looking at that equation here, you could tell that the power is going to have to be 1. So x equals 1 will be your answer.